Okay, we're back, and in this segment, we're going to talk about culture and behavior. So much of our behavior is socially programmed, right? If you think about a lot of the things that you do each day, these are things that culture has really emphasized in us. We are increasingly surrounded by cultural diversity as, we are, the American culture has become more diverse over the past, 40 years. Media presentations have become more diverse. The world has opened up to us thanks to probably the internet, right? In ways that we didn't know a lot of things, and then now those things are being shared with us. So we're being surrounded by a lot more cultural diversity. It's really important to know for all people around the world, confronting another culture is sometimes a startling experience. When we talk about our behavior being socially programmed, those behaviors I'm talking about are things like obviously language, right? Like that's one of the biggest differences between cultures is their language. Even cultures that share what we call mother tongue, right? Like the same original language, speak very differently. I mean, think about, actual England English. Well, and within England, there are lots of different dialects and vocabularies. But comparing us to England here in the US or to Canada or to Australia or New Zealand or South Africa, you're seeing significant differences in accents, for one thing, but also word choice, grammatical structure. It's surprising to me sometimes to hear the things that people from England say that are so different from how we say it in the US. They actually spell aluminum differently than we do. They call it aluminium, and they actually spell it differently than us. I thought they were just pronouncing it differently. They literally spell it differently than us. And let's not even get into, the presence of use in words like color and behavior. So spelling, but they basically are saying it the same way, but they spell it differently. It's surprising when you look at, even within the same language, the differences. I speak Spanish at a very elementary level because I haven't practiced very well. I minored in it in college, but I just haven't spoken it enough. But some of the words that I learned in my college level and my high school level classes are not the words that they actually use in Mexico. So I was wanting to get shampoo, and I asked for shampoo, and then they wanted to know whether it was for my body or my hair, and I wanted it for my hair, and so I said pelo, and they looked at me like, what? Because that's apparently the word they use in Spain for hair. In Mexico, they use the word cabello. And I was a little surprised by that because I was like, wait, why did I learn pelo? If I live literally with a border to Mexico, why would you teach me pelo, right? It really surprised me. But it's, even within a single language, you may literally have people who don't know what you're talking about because of the vocabulary or the pronunciation. And then, of course, we have customs that are present in cultures. And I mean, different areas here in the U.S. have different customs. I've had a really hard time adapting my, I've spent most of my life along the, legitimate coast, the west coast of California, of the U.S. From California up to Seattle. I've lived in lots of places right along that coast. Moving inland, there are different customs, and it's been kind of hard. One of them being you're supposed to be on time. You're supposed to be on time when you move, inside of the mountains that are, along the coast. And I got to tell you what, that is hard for me. I am, we called it fashionably late when I was growing up, but I mean, we always said if you were within 15 minutes, you're on time. But apparently, where I live now, you're supposed to be 5 minutes early to be on time. So that's a custom. I've had a lot of that means I got to be 20 minutes ahead of when I think I'm supposed to be there. So it's very, that's a custom that I'm having trouble getting used to. Other expressive behaviors, in some cultures, they don't smile very much, and in other cultures, they do. If you smile a lot, in some cultures, that's perceived as you trying to be tricky. I'm trying to fool someone. And so different expressive behaviors, that's just an example. Under the, cultural diversity issue, like I mentioned, the internet has really brought us together, but people are traveling a lot more. I mean, even 50 years ago, people didn't fly places. People couldn't afford to go to Europe. I mean, it wasn't something that people did. People didn't, take cruises and be gone for months and months. Like only the wealthiest, most upper crust people could do that. Regular people couldn't really travel like that. And so this access for the average person to be able to travel more has really opened people's eyes. And then of course, international trade. There are a lot of people now who, they go live in another country for years while they're working for their company or whatever. Having close contacts with trading partners and things like that have really opened people's eyes. And then, I think migration and refugee situations have probably been, the human condition forever. I mean, that's why people move around, and that's why people leave where they're from all the time. But now that we have, much more solid borders and people are, all around the world, people are now having to ask permission to enter other countries and stuff. The need for migration and the need for evacuation has really brought cultures together in ways that they hadn't before. Like people didn't, until they meet somebody from another place who came here as a refugee, not because they just always wanted to come to the new place, but because they needed to get away from the dangerous place they were in. When they land in the new place, they oftentimes, they're disoriented, it's confusing, and so they really lean on other people from the same place and try and maintain some sense of normality for themselves. And so that causes people in the surrounding area to learn about these cultural customs and differences. It oftentimes causes great friendships where people are like, wow, tell me more about where you came from and tell me more about, well, how do you guys do things and like that. But it also can cause conflict when, a person says, well, that's weird. Why do you do that? Those kinds of little off the cuff comments can make it hard for people to be friends and actually can lead to conflict. So definitely problems that can come from cultural connectedness. It's really super important for all of us to realize that every culture is established. They all are, every culture has its rules, its mores, its norms. A lot of times we display a type of ethnocentrism where we say our culture is judgmental. Our culture is, discriminatory. Our culture, I see it in a lot of my students' papers. They'll say, in our culture today, people do this or that. And they are completely unaware that in every culture around the world, there are accepted ideas about what is okay and what is not okay to be doing. Every culture has them. We call these norms. They're standards for accepted and expected behavior. Every culture has norms about all sorts of things, ranging from what it means to be a kid, like what are kids allowed to do and what things you can't do until you're an adult. Every culture has norms about what the sexes should be doing, what parents should be doing, how bosses should act, what an employee should act like. Like every culture has a bunch of norms about a bunch of things, about everything. They really prescribe for the individuals within the culture what the proper behavior is. And it's not always the case that just because you're new to the culture and you don't understand the norms, it doesn't mean that everybody in the culture they accept the norms, but they maybe don't embrace the norms. Like in every culture, there's someone over there saying, I wish this isn't how my culture was. And all around the world, there are people who are not even thinking about what the cultural norms are because it's just so part of their life. It is what you do. You don't think about it. It's what we're all doing. It is what it is, right? I put normal in quotation marks and I put proper in quotation marks because I'm trying to underscore that issue that not everybody agrees with their culture's norms. They may display behaviors that imply that they go along with them and inside their heads they're rebelling, or they might just go ahead and rebel outwardly. right? Like you don't know what degree an individual within a culture is agreeing with the norms. Because the people who are within those norms, sometimes they feel like those norms are arbitrary. Like, why are we doing it like this? Couldn't we do something else? Like why? Who said this is how it has to be, right? Some people find norms very confining. Like, I don't want to be behaving like this. You're making me behave in a way that is not my natural tendency, not the thing I would choose for myself. And so we see this all around the world with people who are sort of buckling, they don't want to be doing it. Whenever we're in a situation where we're not sure what the norms are, our typical response is to monitor other people's behavior and then adjust our own behavior accordingly. You may have experienced that when you started going to college or university. You looked around. What is everybody else using to hold their books? What kinds of clothes are other people wearing to class? Just like little small things like that give you the information that you need so you can fit in with this new group of people who you haven't met before and, blend in, right? Like that's the goal, is to try and fit into the group. And so we are very aware of looking around, seeing how to moderate our own behaviors based on what other people are doing. And so, this can range from a small group setting to a very large group setting where, you've moved to a whole new area and you're trying to figure out, okay, how am I supposed to act day to day? What's normal? So we are acutely aware of these things and we attempt to conform. Nobody's asked us to do it necessarily, but we attempt to conform. Oops, I have an animation problem there. Cultures vary in their norms for many behaviors. There are a lot of cultural variations around the world for what would be an appropriate behavior in a certain context. One big difference would be, individual choices. Is this culture more of an individualistic one or is it more of a collectivistic one? And like I said when we were talking about this before, it's not that an entire culture is one or the other. It's that the messaging, like the norms that they want, that the culture attempts to convey, gives the impression that it's one way or another, right? So you pick up, how much my individual choice really matters. Another way that cultures vary is that expressiveness that I was talking about before. Some cultures don't smile much. Other cultures talk a lot more quietly than other cultures, right? Like it's inappropriate to have a loud conversation in some cultures in a public place, and in other cultures it's completely fine. Some cultures it's okay to hold hands with your romantic partner as you walk down the street, and in other cultures it's inappropriate. These differences are important and meaningful. I already mentioned the punctuality one. Here within the U.S., there are different regions with different emphasis on punctuality. Around the world, some cultures are more punctual and other cultures are less punctual. On average, the ones that are closer to the equator tend to be less punctual than the ones that are farther away from the equator. That's just sort of a rule of thumb. There's some theories having to do with, the heat of the day and other kinds of things that make it sort of like, we'll get to it when we can after it cools down around here, these kinds of things. But so the thing about these cultural norms is that every culture has rules for pretty much everything. That's a good way to gloss it over. Pretty much everything. Some cultures have really strong norms and they're very clear about them, and the messaging starts from birth and it's reinforced throughout school, and you enter adulthood and you have really internalized the norms. Other cultures have weaker norms where there's a lot more variation. And one of the things that you'll see is that individualistic cultures, the norms are not as strong as they are in collectivistic cultures. So there's a lot more variability in individualistic cultures. You have more freedom to behave in the ways that sound okay to you and not necessarily have to, knuckle under to the norms. There's still that uncomfortable moment, though, when you show up 5 minutes late and everybody else got here 5 minutes early. And so there's still that. There are these individual moments within an individualistic culture that you're going to still be held to account for not behaving in ways that everybody expected. But on average, individualistic cultures are a little less rigid than collectivistic cultures with regard to their norms. Personal space is a really interesting one. Here in the US, we have a personal space buffer that's about at least one of your arm's length. It's a matter of how close you are to the person. If it's a completely new stranger, it's not surprising to see, let's say somebody approached you and asked you for directions somewhere on the street. Probably you're going to stand about 6 feet away from them on average here in the US. Whereas in other cultures, if you were going to ask somebody directions, you would get right up next to them because you're probably going to need to talk more quietly because your cultural norm is that you don't stand 6 feet away and shout something. You get up close and you have a conversation. And so in the US, with strangers, it's about 6 feet. With friends, it's probably more like 3 feet. And then you get into each other's bubbles more. The better you know the person, the more intimate the relationship is. But on average in the US, we have one of the larger bubbles around us. Our personal space bubble is larger than in other cultures. And collectivistic cultures tend to have smaller bubbles than individualistic cultures tend to have. So just little things that we vary on. So it's really important to think about our nuclear family as really our first cultural training, right? Our parents try and teach us things. Things that we know for sure parents have a big impact on are things like religious beliefs, values, manners, attitudes, politics, habits. These are things that our parents, a lot of times without any overt intention, they just sort of pass along the message about what's important and how we think about these things, stuff like that. So these are the factors that parents clearly have an impact on. What's a little bit dismaying to parents maybe, and I think misrepresented in our own personal minds as individuals, like what was more important to us becoming who we are, our parents or our friends? Well, it turns out our parents have an influence on the things that I just listed, but peers have a huge impact in transmitting the culture of our age group, of our cohort. So when we talk about transmission, we're really talking about heritability. We're talking about how can we account for individual differences in personality traits, behaviors, attitudes, things like that. Genetic influences, the actual I inherited it part, the genetic influences account for about 40% of individual differences. The shared environmental influences, which would be the things that happen in the household, the things that our parents probably had control over, account for 0 to about 1% of the individual differences that have been observed. But much of the rest is probably due to peer influence, non-shared environments. So when we talk about heritability, we're talking about how much of the way that we behave is attributable to our genes, how much of it is attributable to our home environment, and then how much of it is attributable to the larger world. So one of the tricks with these heritability measures is they really underestimate, I think, the role of the shared environment, because our parents give us our genes usually, right? Your biological parents give you your genes, and then they usually also give you your shared environment. So you are being raised by a person who shares your genes. So it's really, there's this big overlap between the genes that your parents gave you and then the environment that they provided for you as you were growing up. So when we pull those two things apart, most of the explanation can be attributed to genes. Well, you probably inherited that biologically. And then this teeny tiny portion is like, yeah, and then there was this stylistic stuff that happened in the house. The vast majority of the rest, about 60% of the rest, is going to be attributable to stuff that's happening outside the house, what we call the non-shared environment. in this peer influence, non-shared environment, children and youth learn their culture, which we could say runs the gamut from what games they like to play to the music that they listen to, their speech accents, dirty words that they have, things like that. They can point to their peers for the biggest bulk of those kinds of things. I mean, just let's think about games. I mean, 150 years ago, I'll bet lots of kids played things like Ring Around the Rosie and, I don't know, Catch, and like a lot of movement games and a lot of, pickup games in the schoolyard and things like that. 100 years ago, they started introducing board games like Monopoly and things like that. So, probably 100 years to maybe 50 years ago, really common to have a lot of board games and, Sorry and Risk and these kinds of things came out. And so these kinds of games, and historically, I mean, there's been Mandala and other kinds of games that Go and other, chess and things. I'm just saying like board games, like these complicated rules and fake money and that kind of stuff that, like Hasbro or Mattel make. Those really came out in the 30s. And so, kids grew up playing those things. They played them with their children, and it was part of their cohort. Today, there are people who were raised playing video games, and now they're playing video games with their children, right? And that's part of how we transmit culture to our offspring, right? Is that, the things that we did with our peers and that we think of as fun childhood things, we reintroduce when we have kids. Or maybe we never stop doing it. In the case of video games, I think a lot of people who play them kind of never stop, as opposed to like, you might have put your Monopoly away, and then when you had kids, you're like, hey, I'm going to teach my, 10-year-old how to play Monopoly now. So the kinds of games that people play, a lot of times it's what they played with their family or with their peers. And their peers oftentimes are the ones who introduce them to new things, right? You have a game that you play with your family, and then you go over to your friend's house to spend the night, and you're like, hey, I've never played that game. Wow, I've never seen that one before. That's how peers really can open our eyes and expand our horizons. And so they teach us things that, if it were up to us to live in, let's say in a pandemic where we spent an entire year alone with just our nuclear family under our roof, we might not expand out and come up with new and novel things to do because we're all like, well, I'm out. Those are all the ideas I had. Whereas by having interactions with other people, our horizons get broadened, and we find out that there are other things that we could do. New dirty words that we didn't know. I teach human sexuality, and I have an exercise that we do in my face-to-face class where the students come up with dirty words for body parts and stuff. And I am every time surprised that there's a new word for something. I'm like, man, linguistics never stop. There's always a new word for something. So it's really, and then the other thing that I think is really interesting is that, you can have parents who are immigrants from another country, so they have an accent in English, or in American English at least, and their kids will develop the accent of their peers. So it shows you how influential the peers are in these really fundamental transmission of cultural things. So while cultures do differ, obviously, that's the whole point, right? Cultures differ, but the processes that underlie our differing behaviors are similar everywhere. I mean, it's not like one culture does something right or wrong and everybody else does it, the other way or something. Like the processes are very similar, even though the ultimate manifestation of the behaviors and stuff might differ. There are very common norms for friendship. I mean, friendship all around the world is viewed as something where, you're supposed to be able to support each other and be, take each other's sides, things like that. Very common norms around the world. The personality dimensions, we've had personality researchers go all around the world and collect data from all different cultures and little tiny towns and big cities and all over the place. And they have come to the conclusion that there really are these two basic personality dimensions, regardless of culture. So there's like these very similar processes sort of underlying people's approach to the world, called personality traits. There are very similar processes for determining whether a person is a good person or a bad person, right? There's it may vary. Some cultures maybe have a higher tolerance for, I'm trying to think of the right word for sort of taking advantage of other people. Sort of some cultures have less, more of a buyer beware attitude than other cultures do, right? But all cultures agree that killing is bad, right? Or a person who takes advantage of other people for their own gain, things like that. Like every culture has these certain underlying processes. The dimensions of social beliefs. There's a lot of similarity across cultures with regard to these processes for determining, how to determine what our culture values, or how to determine how to adhere to what our culture values, things like that. And then every culture has status hierarchies. There's no such thing in the entire world as any group larger than 150 where you don't have, sanctified, codified social hierarchies where somebody gets to make decisions on behalf of other people and things like that. Even in very small groups, even in groups of people today who live in more hunter-gatherer kinds of situations, there's always someone who's the leader, other people who are sort of the leader's assistants, right? I mean, that's it. Social hierarchies, status hierarchies are present in every group. Even in preschoolers, they see these kinds of status hierarchies emerge. So, I mean, it's part of culture to have status hierarchies. And then there are processes for adapting to language. There's always complexity when new terms are coming into vogue, or new uses for old words, things like that. There's always this sort of tension that happens within a culture as they're trying to figure out, well, what are you trying to get us to agree to by saying that word now means something else? Like what exactly are we agreeing to? There's tension whenever that happens because change always brings a little tension. But there's sort of a cultural process for how to ultimately settle it out. And every culture sort of goes through these same things. I thought you guys would find this interesting. This is a word cloud created from posts that were made on Facebook in India on the left side, the US on the right side. And what you can see is that if the word is bigger, that means that the word correlated more with the values that they were looking at. What I was interested in is the color of the words, because that's the relative frequency with which those words appeared on Facebook. And so I thought I'd point out for you some similarities. Things like love showed up, same color, and in fact, it's the same size. So love, very similar. And then also good, they're a little off on color. It looks like in the US it's used a little bit more frequently than in India, but it's a pretty common, very for both cultures, similarity. Some of the differences I thought I'd point out are things like, look how frequently you see thank, thanks, other things related to thanks in India. It's smaller, it's a lighter, it's a blue color instead of a green color, so that means it's less frequent. Don't see thanks as often in US posts. And then also you'll notice that the word win appears with high frequency in the US, and I couldn't find it at all in the word cloud from India. And so it looks like that's something that they don't talk about. And so just little cultural differences. And of course, the thing about the US Facebook posts, the word win might be referring to having watched a professional sporting event and, the Seahawks won, something like that. But in India, they have sporting events and they have professional teams. And so the word didn't pop up as often. So it's an interesting difference. The researchers think that it has to do with, individualism in the US and, valuing winning more. But it's kind of an interesting one. The other thing I noticed, and I didn't want to point at all of them because it would have really been a mess, but look how often there's something related to ha-ha or funny on the India side versus trying to find it on the US side. I see hee-hee, I see ha-ha-ha, funny, I see haha, laugh, right? There's just a bunch of different things having to do with laughter is up there, being amusing, right? On the US side, I see fun, but I'm not seeing so much haha. I do see LOL. Oh, I see a tiny ha 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 and a ha. But it's just not, there's also a hee hee on the US side. But it's just not as big, and it's not as green leaning, which means more frequent, as it is on the India side. So I thought that was kind of interesting that maybe they want to convey good humor more in India on Facebook than the US does. So I thought you guys would find that interesting. All right, let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back and we'll talk about sex versus gender.